When the military transport stopped before the prisoner of war camp in Texas, 3 German generals, men whom Goebbels had praised as unbreakable warriors who would never bow to the enemy, stood frozen. They had steeled themselves for darkness, torture, starvation, everything the propaganda machine had painted. But the moment they sat down at their first table on American soil, facing plates of hot meat, soft bread, butter, coffee, and courteous guards, the entire edifice of lies they'd believed for years shattered. And that was only the beginning. The transport ship cut through the Atlantic swells with mechanical indifference, carrying its cargo of defeated men westward. Below deck, in a converted hold that smelled of salt and diesel, 3 German generals sat in silence. General Wilhelm Krause was 52, his face carved from granite and privation. His iron cross sat heavy against his chest, a weight he'd earned in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. Next to him, General Ernst Hoffman, younger by a decade, stared at his hands. They were the hands of a man who'd commanded armor divisions across North Africa. Now, empty and useless. The third man, General Otto Brenner, stood by the porthole, watching America draw closer with each hour. None of them spoke. The journey had been long. From the rubble of Normandy, they'd been processed through holding facilities in England. Documents, photographs, questions delivered in clipped British accents. Then the port, the gangway, the hold of this American vessel. Each step had been procedural, almost boring in its efficiency. No beatings, no mockery, just forms and orders. But the silence in Krause's mind was deafening. For 3 years, he'd heard Dr. Goebbels' voice crackling through every radio in every command post. The Americans are savages, the propaganda minister had declared. They will strip you of dignity. They will parade you like animals. Their camps are cesspools where German officers are reduced to begging for scraps. Krause had believed it. Why wouldn't he? The ministry had shown photographs staged. He now suspected of emaciated men behind barbed wire. Testimonials from escaped prisoners describing torture. The narrative was consistent, repeated until it became truth. Hoffman finally broke the silence. Do you think they'll separate us? Probably, Brenner said without turning from the porthole. Divide and interrogate. Standard procedure. I won't tell them anything. Hoffman's voice carried the brittleness of a man trying to convince himself. Krause studied his younger colleague. Hoffman had been a believer, one of those officers who'd worn his party pin with genuine pride. Even now, after the collapse, after the surrender, some ember of that faith still burned. It was almost pitiable. They won't need to torture you for information, Krause said quietly. The war is over. Then what do they want? That was the question that had gnawed at Krause for weeks. If the Americans had already won, if the Reich was truly finished, why the careful processing? Why the medical examinations on the ship? Why had they been given blankets and adequate rations during the crossing? It didn't match the narrative, but narratives were hard to kill. They burrowed into the mind like shrapnel, festering. Krause had spent his entire adult life in the Wehrmacht, had risen through ranks built on discipline and doctrine. To question the fundamental story that the enemy was barbaric, that German suffering was noble, that the cause had been just, was to question everything. The ship's engines changed pitch. Brenner pressed his face closer to the porthole. Land, he announced. Looks like Texas. Flat. Hot. Hoffman made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Heat. Well, at least it's not Russia. Krause closed his eyes. Russia. The winter of 42. Watching men freeze in their positions. Literally freeze. Their bodies becoming statues of ice. Watching supply lines collapse. Watching the grand offensive crumble into desperate retreat. He'd lost 2/3 of his division in 6 months. The Americans had food on this ship. Coffee every morning. The guards, young men with Midwestern accents, had been correct. Even respectful. When a private had accidentally bumped into Hoffman on deck, the boy had apologized. Apologized to a German general. What if Goebbels was wrong? Brenner's voice was so soft, Krause almost missed it. Hoffman's head snapped up. That's treason. Treason against what? Brenner turned from the porthole, his expression unreadable. Against a government that no longer exists? Against a Führer who… Careful. Krause's tone was a warning. Even here, even defeated, the old reflexes died hard. You didn't speak certain thoughts aloud. Not where others could hear. The Gestapo had trained them all well, but Brenner was right to ask. The question sat in the room like a fourth presence. Hours later, they felt the ship dock, the sounds of a port shouting, machinery, the groan of metal on metal filtered through the hull. Then footsteps, American voices, casual and efficient. Generals Krause, Hoffman, and Brenner. A young officer stood at the door of their hold, a clipboard in his hand. He was impossibly clean, his uniform crisp, his face showing none of the hard miles that marked every German soldier Krause had known. Yes, Krause answered in English. His accent was thick, but serviceable. Transport is ready. We'll be taking you to Camp Herne. It's about 100 miles inland. What kind of camp? Hoffman's voice was tight. The American looked genuinely confused by the question. Prisoner of war camp, sir. You'll be processed there, sir. The American had called him sir. They were led up to the deck. The Texas sun hit like a hammer bright, merciless, nothing like the pale European light they'd known. A truck waited, its engine idling. More young soldiers, more efficiency. As they climbed into the truck bed, Krause caught sight of the port. Warehouses stuffed with supplies. Ships being unloaded by the dozen. Forklifts moving pallets of goods with casual abundance. The sheer scale of American industrial capacity was staggering. My God, Brenner whispered. We never had a chance. Did we? Hoffman said nothing, but Krause saw his hands trembling. The truck rolled through the Texas landscape, endless flatness broken by scrub and the occasional farmhouse. The heat was oppressive, but the guards had given them water, actual water, in canteens that weren't rusted or filled with disease. Krause's mind kept circling back to one image. The young soldier who'd apologized for bumping into Hoffman. In the Wehrmacht, such an interaction would have been unthinkable. Officers were gods. Enlisted men were tools, but that American boy had seen Hoffman as a person. Even in defeat. Even as a prisoner. What kind of enemy does that? The question terrified Krause more than any artillery barrage ever had. Because if the Americans weren't monsters, if Goebbels had lied about this, then what else had been lies? The truck slowed. Ahead, guard towers rose against the blue sky. Barbed wire glinted in the Sunday. This was it. Camp Herne. The moment of truth. Krause straightened his uniform. A gesture of pure habit. Whatever came next, torture, deprivation, humiliation, he would face it, as a German officer should, with dignity, with silence. The gates opened, and General Wilhelm Krause's world began to crack. The truck passed through the gates and stopped in front of a wooden administrative building. The compound beyond was vast rows of barracks, a parade ground, facilities that looked orderly and maintained. This wasn't the hellscape of Goebbels' descriptions. This looked military. An American lieutenant approached as they dismounted. He was lean, maybe 30, with the bearing of a professional soldier. Generals, I'm Lieutenant Anderson. I'll be handling your intake processing. Intake processing. The phrase was so bureaucratic, so mundane, that it felt surreal. Anderson led them into the building. Inside was cooler fans turning lazily overhead. A clerk sat at a desk, typewriter at the ready. Everything was organized, labeled, filed. The Americans loved their paperwork. First, we'll need to verify your identities and ranks, Anderson said, consulting a folder. General Wilhelm Krause, formerly commanding the 217th Infantry Division. General Ernst Hoffman, 8th Panzer Division. General Otto Brenner, 44th Infantry Division. Is that correct? Yes, Krause answered. His throat was dry despite the water. Good. You'll each be assigned quarters appropriate to your rank. Officers of general rank are housed separately from other prisoners, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention. Krause knew the terms, had studied them at the War College decades ago. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The Germans had paid lip service to Geneva, where it suited them. In the East, such niceties had been abandoned entirely. Yet here was this American lieutenant, citing international law as if it mattered. "You will not be required to work," Anderson continued. "Your movements within the camp will be restricted to designated areas, but you'll have access to recreational facilities, the library, and the canteen." Library. Canteen. The words felt like they belonged to a different language. Hoffman spoke up, his voice uncertain. "What about interrogation?" Anderson looked at him with what seemed like genuine surprise. "You'll be interviewed by intelligence officers in the coming days." "Yes. But it will be conducted properly. You have the right to refuse to answer questions beyond name, rank, and serial number." "And if we refuse?" Brenner asked. "Then you refuse." Anderson shrugged. "We're not in the business of coercion, General. That's not how we operate." The silence that followed was heavy. Krause could feel his companions struggling with the same cognitive dissonance that gripped him. Everything they'd been told, everything they'd prepared for it, was all wrong. "This way," Anderson said, leading them down a corridor. They passed offices where American personnel worked at desks. Typewriters clacked. Someone laughed at a joke. The atmosphere was almost relaxed. No shouting, no brutality. Just work. Anderson stopped at a door. "General Krause, this will be your quarters." The room was small but clean. A proper bed with actual mattress, not just a cot. A desk and chair. A window with a view of the compound. A locker for personal effects. On the bed lay a neatly folded set of olive drab clothing, prisoner uniforms, but in good condition. "Your uniforms will be kept in storage," Anderson explained. "You'll wear these for the duration of your stay. Laundry facilities are available twice weekly." Krause stepped inside. The room smelled of wood and soap. No dampness, no rot, no evidence of previous suffering. "The latrine and showers are at the end of the hall," Anderson continued. "Hot water is available each evening from 6 to 8. Hot water. Krause had commanded men who'd died for less, who'd killed for less. "I don't understand," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Anderson paused in the doorway. "Sir, why?" Krause gestured at the room, at the window, at everything. "We are your enemy. We have killed your soldiers. Why treat us like this?" The lieutenant's expression softened. "Because you're prisoners of war, General, not animals. The United States is a signatory to the Geneva Convention, and we take that obligation seriously. You fought for your country. Your country lost. That doesn't make you less than human." He said it so simply, as if it were obvious, as if there were no other way to think. After Anderson left to show the others to their quarters, Krause sat on the bed. It gave slightly under his weight, real springs, real padding. Outside his window, he could see prisoners in the compound yard. Some were playing volleyball. Others sat in the shade, talking or reading. Reading. When had German soldiers last had time to read? A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Brenner stepped in, his face pale. "Have you seen this?" "Seen what?" "The canteen." "I walked past it." "Krause. They're selling chocolate and cigarettes. The prisoners can buy them with camp scrip." "Scrip?" "They pay the prisoners for work details. Not much, but enough to buy little luxuries. One of the guards told me." Krause absorbed this. "They pay prisoners." "Yes." Brenner sat on the edge of the desk. "I asked about punishment. For infractions. The guard said they use isolation removal of privileges. No beatings. No torture." He seemed offended when I suggested it. They sat in silence for a long moment. "We were lied to," Brenner finally said. "About everything." Before Krause could respond, another knock. A medic appeared, a young corporal with a medical bag. "Generals, I'm here to conduct your initial health screening." "Screening?" Hoffman appeared behind the medic, looking bewildered. "They're examining us." "Standard procedure, sir," the corporal said cheerfully. "Make sure you don't have any injuries or conditions that need immediate treatment." Immediate treatment. For prisoners. For Germans. The medic was thorough. He checked Krause's old leg wound from Stalingrad, asked about pain, made notes. "This should be monitored," he said. "I'll schedule you for follow-up with the camp physician. We want to make sure infection doesn't recur." "You'll treat it?" Krause asked. The corporal looked at him with those earnest American eyes. "Of course, sir. It's our job to maintain prisoner health." After the medic left, the three generals gathered in Krause's room. Night was falling, turning the Texas sky purple and gold. In the distance, they could hear prisoners being called to evening mess. "I don't know what to think anymore," Hoffman said. His voice had lost its earlier defiance. He sounded young, frightened. Krause understood. The certainty that had carried them through years of war was dissolving like sugar in rain. And without that certainty, what were they? Just men who'd believed lies and sent other men to die for those lies. The smell of cooking food drifted through the window. Real food. Meat and bread and something else. Something that made Krause's stomach clench with hunger he'd forgotten he could feel. Tomorrow, they would eat their first meal in America. Tomorrow, the last pillars of propaganda would fall. But tonight, in this clean room with its proper bed and its view of men playing volleyball in the fading light, General Wilhelm Krause sat and felt the weight of truth settling onto his shoulders like lead. Morning came with the sound of a bell. Not a harsh alarm, but a clear, almost musical tone that signaled the start of the camp day. Krause had barely slept, his mind too full of contradictions and questions, but the bed had been comfortable. Astonishingly so. An escort arrived at 0700, a corporal with a clipboard and a polite knock. "Generals? Medical has you scheduled at 0730. "I'll show you the way." The three of them followed him across the compound. In the daylight, Camp Hearn revealed itself more fully. The grounds were well maintained, almost manicured. Prisoners moved about with a freedom that seemed impossible. Some carried books, others had letters in hand, clearly heading to mail call. "They let them send letters?" Hoffman asked. "Yes, sir," the corporal replied. "1 letter per week, outgoing. Incoming mail is censored, of course, but they get to write home." Home. Most of these men's homes were rubble now, but the Americans didn't know that, or didn't care to use it as another form of cruelty. The medical facility was a converted barracks, clean and organized. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp, clinical. Speaking of resources and care, a nurse female, which startled all three of them, directed them to examination rooms. Dr. Marcus Webb was a captain, probably 45, with graying hair and steady hands. He greeted Krause with a handshake, an actual handshake, as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive. "General Krause, please have a seat. I'm going to conduct a full physical examination. It's standard for all incoming prisoners, regardless of rank. I was examined by the medic yesterday," Krause said. "That was a screening. This is more thorough." Webb pulled out a chart. "I see from your records you took shrapnel to your left leg in 1943. How does it feel now?" "It aches, especially in cold weather." "May I examine it?" Krause rolled up his trouser leg. The scar was ugly, puckered, and discolored. Webb's fingers were gentle as he probed the area, checking for heat, swelling, range of motion. "You had pieces removed, obviously," Webb said. "But there's still some fragmentation here, here, and here. Feel this?" He guided Krause's fingers to small, hard lumps under the skin. "I've carried them for 2 years. They're causing inflammation. Not serious yet, but it could become problematic. With your permission, I'd like to schedule a minor surgical procedure to remove them." Krause stared at him. "You want to operate on me? It's a simple procedure. Local anesthetic. Maybe 45 minutes. You'd be back to quarters the same day." Webb made a note. "The alternative is increased pain and possible infection down the line. Your choice, General." "Choice." The word kept appearing in American mouths, as if prisoners had agency, autonomy. I need to think about it, of course. Take your time. Webb continued the examination, checking reflexes, listening to heart and lungs, testing vision. You're malnourished, but not critically. We'll get you back to proper weight with regular meals. Blood pressure is elevated, probably stress-related. Any chest pains? No. Good. Any other complaints I should know about? Krause thought about lying, about hiding the weakness. But what was the point? My teeth. I've lost 2 molars. Others are loose. Webb frowned. Open up, please. The examination was uncomfortable but thorough. When Webb finished, his expression was grave. You have advanced periodontal disease and several cavities. I'm referring you to our dentist. We can save most of your teeth, but you'll need several appointments. Your dentist? Krause repeated dumbly. Captain Morrison. Good man. He'll take care of you. In the next examination room, Brenner was having a similar experience. His old shoulder injury, a bullet wound from France in 1940, had healed badly. The American doctor was explaining surgical options to repair the damage. But I'm a prisoner, Brenner protested. Why would you spend resources on me? The doctor, a Major Phillips, looked at him with something like pity. Because you're injured, General. That's what we do. We treat injured people. In the third room, Hoffman was the most shaken. The examination had revealed a partially healed rib fracture from a Jeep accident 2 months before the surrender that had knitted him properly. The American physician was explaining that they'd need to re-break and reset it. It will hurt, the doctor admitted. But we have anesthesia, and it will heal correctly this time. Without intervention, you'll have chronic pain and breathing difficulties. When the 3 generals reconvened in the waiting area, they sat in stunned silence. A nurse brought them water cold, clean water in actual glasses, and told them their prescriptions would be ready within the hour. Prescriptions, medical care, surgery. I don't understand their angle. Hoffman finally said. What do they want from us? Maybe, Brenner said quietly. They don't want anything. Maybe they're just doing what they think is right. No one is that naive. But Hoffman's voice lacked conviction. Krause thought about Dr. Webb's hands, careful and professional as they'd examined his leg. The doctor had seen him as a patient, not an enemy. The distinction seemed to matter to Americans in a way it never had mattered to Germans. How many Russian prisoners had the Wehrmacht examined? How many had been offered surgery to improve their quality of life? The answer made Krause feel sick. A different corporal appeared. Generals, your quarters assignments have been finalized. I'll walk you back, and then it'll be time for lunch. Lunch. The word hung in the air like a bell. They followed the corporal through the compound, but Krause was barely aware of his surroundings. His mind was full of the doctor's matter-of-fact compassion, the nurse's professional courtesy, the casual assumption that prisoners deserved health care. Everything he'd believed about America, about the enemy, was proving false. And if that was false, what else? The propaganda machine had painted a picture of American weakness, American decadence, American savagery. Goebbels had called them mongrels, inferior, incapable of true civilization. But civilization, Krause was beginning to understand, wasn't about racial purity or ideological fervor. It was about how you treated the helpless, the defeated, the enemy who could no longer fight back. By that measure, the Reich had been barbaric. By that measure, these Americans were something the propaganda could never have prepared him for. They were decent, and that realization was more devastating than any bomb. The walk back across the compound gave Krause his first real opportunity to observe the camp's daily operations. What he saw continued to upend his expectations with each step. Near the barracks, a group of prisoners, enlisted men, tended a vegetable garden. An American guard stood nearby. But he wasn't watching them like a jailer. He was crouched down, talking to one of the Germans about soil quality, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. That's Corporal Jensen, their escort explained when he noticed Krause's stare. Grew up on a farm in Iowa. He's been helping the prisoners set up the garden. They get to keep half of what they grow for their mess hall. They're allowed to grow food? Brenner asked. Sure. Gives them something productive to do. Good for morale. The escort said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They passed the recreation area. Prisoners played cards at picnic tables under shade trees. Others read books. Actual books, not propaganda pamphlets. A makeshift handball court saw vigorous play, with spectators calling encouragement in German. Libraries in that building there. The corporal pointed. About 2,000 volumes now. Mostly donated, some purchased. We've got German texts, English texts, technical manuals. Prisoners can check out 3 books at a time. Hoffman made a sound that might have been laughter or despair. They give us books. Education is important, the corporal said. Command believes that keeping prisoners intellectually engaged reduces discipline problems. They arrived at a separate building smaller, set slightly apart from the main barracks. A sign read, Officer Housing, Ranks 07 and above. This is where you'll be staying, the escort explained. Separate from the enlisted men, per regulations. Each of you has a private room. There's a common area with seating and a table for meals or meetings. Inside, the building was simple, but immaculately maintained. Wood floors, recently swept. Windows that actually opened, allowing in the breeze. The common room had chairs that looked comfortable, a bookshelf, even a radio. The radio is operational, the corporal continued. You're allowed to listen to American broadcasts, news, music, baseball games. There are some restrictions on frequencies, but generally, you have access. You allow us to hear your news? Krause couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Why not? The war's over, General. You'll hear what's happening whether we want you to or not. Better to give you accurate information than have rumors spread. The corporal showed them the facilities. Washroom here. Showers have hot water mornings and evenings. Laundry can be done in the enlisted facility, or you can hand wash here in the basins. Your choice. That word again, choice. He led them to their individual rooms. Each was identical 12 by 12 feet. A single bed with a real mattress and 2 blankets. A desk with a chair, a footlocker, and a small window. On each bed lay the prisoner uniforms they'd been promised. 2 sets of clothes, clean and mended, with rank insignia appropriate to their status. Insignia? Hoffman picked up the shirt, examining the general's stars sewn onto the collar. You're still officers, the corporal said. You still rate your rank, even in captivity. In Krause's room, someone had left a small vase with wildflowers on the desk. Texas bluebells, he thought, though he wasn't sure. The gesture was so utterly incongruous that he couldn't process it. Who left these? He asked. The corporal looked embarrassed. My wife, sir. She volunteers with the camp auxiliary. She likes to put flowers in the quarters when new prisoners arrive. Says it makes the place feel less institutional. An American woman had put flowers in a German general's room. To make him feel welcome, Krause sat on the bed. It didn't squeak. The mattress was firm but yielding. Above him, a ceiling fan turned lazily, moving the hot air. Through the window, he could see prisoners walking to what looked like a chapel. Is that a church? Brenner asked from the doorway. Protestant and Catholic services are held Sunday mornings, the corporal confirmed. Rabbi Goldstein from Austin comes monthly for Jewish prisoners. All attendance is voluntary. You have a rabbi minister to German prisoners, Brenner said flatly. Yes, sir. Freedom of religion is in the Constitution. Applies to everyone. After the escort left, the 3 generals gathered in the common room. The silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Hoffman walked to the window and stared out at the compound. This isn't what we were told, he said. None of this is what Goebbels said. Goebbels lied. Brenner's voice was hollow. About this. About how much else? Krause thought about the ministry's photographs of starving prisoners. The testimonials of torture. The stories of American barbarism. All of it calculated, designed to keep German soldiers fighting, even when hope was lost. Fight to the death. because surrender means something worse than death. Except it didn't. Surrender meant clean quarters and hot water and medical care and flowers on your desk. My men, Hoffman said quietly. The boys I commanded. I told them never to surrender. I told them the Americans would torture them. Some of them died because they believed me. You believed it too, Brenner said. We all did. Does that excuse it? No one answered. A bell rang the same musical tone from morning, signaling the next activity. Through the window, they watched prisoners begin moving toward a large building at the compound center. That must be the mess hall, Krause said. His stomach was tight with something that wasn't quite hunger. It was anticipation mixed with dread. The medical examination had shaken him. The quarters had confused him. But the meal would be the test. Food was primal. Food told the truth about how a society valued human life. In the Wehrmacht, officers ate well while enlisted men subsisted on ersatz coffee and thin soup. In the Eastern Territories, German soldiers requisitioned food from civilians, leaving populations to starve. The hierarchy of who ate and who went hungry revealed everything about power and contempt. What would American prison food reveal? We should change, Brenner said, looking at the uniforms on their beds. If we're going to the mess hall, they returned to their rooms. Krause stripped off his travel-stained Wehrmacht uniform and pulled on the American-issued clothes. The fabric was rough, cotton, utilitarian, but clean. The pants fit reasonably well. The shirt was loose enough to be comfortable in the heat. He caught his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Without his officer's uniform, without the insignia of rank and nation, he looked like what he was, a tired, middle-aged man far from home. When they reconvened, all three wore the same expression, uncertain, vulnerable, stripped of the armor their uniforms had provided. Ready? Brenner asked. No, Krause admitted. But let's go anyway. They stepped out into the Texas afternoon, joining the stream of prisoners heading toward the mess hall. Some of the enlisted men recognized them, snapping to attention out of habit. Krause waved them at ease. What was the point of military discipline now? The mess hall loomed ahead. Through its windows, Krause could see long tables, prisoners already seated, and most disturbing of all, American guards moving among them. Serving food. The enemy, serving them food. Goebbels' entire narrative, about to be tested against reality. Krause's hands were shaking as he reached for the door. The mess hall was larger than Krause had expected, easily big enough for 200 men. Long tables ran the length of the room, benches on either side. The ceiling was high, allowing heat to rise, with fans that actually moved the air. But what stopped Krause in the doorway wasn't the space. It was the smell. Real food, not the cabbage and potato stench of Wehrmacht kitchens, not the indefinable gray gruel of military rations. This smelled like home, like Sunday dinners from before the war. When such things still existed, an American sergeant approached them, consulting a clipboard. Generals, we've reserved a table for officer ranks. This way, please. He led them to a smaller table near the back, set slightly apart. It offered some privacy while still keeping them within the main hall. Already seated, there were two other German officers, both colonels, who stood at their approach. Sir, one of them said, addressing Krause. Colonel Friedrich Weber, formerly of the 12th Panzer. Brief introductions were made. Weber and his companion, Colonel Hans Dietrich, had been at Camp Herne for 3 weeks. Their presence was almost more unsettling than the Americans. These were German officers who'd survived long enough in American captivity to look healthy. Weber had clearly gained weight. His color was good. He looked like a man who was eating regularly. First day? Weber asked with something like sympathy. First meal, Krause admitted. Weber nodded. It's disorienting. But wait until you taste the food. Before Krause could ask what he meant, prisoners began lining up at a serving station. Not a slop line, an actual cafeteria service, with American soldiers and prisoner volunteers manning stations behind steam tables. They're serving us? Hoffman's voice cracked slightly. It rotates, Dietrich explained. American personnel and prisoner volunteers. Keeps everyone involved, command says. Builds. I don't know, community, or some such American nonsense, but he said it without heat. And when a young private brought water pitchers to their table, actual pitchers, actual glasses, Dietrich thanked him in English. The private smiled. "You're welcome, sir. Food will be out in just a minute." Then the serving began. The first tray that arrived at their table held sliced beef. Actual beef, not the mystery meat that had passed for protein in Wehrmacht messes. These were thick slices, still steaming, with real gravy. The smell alone made Krause's mouth water. A second tray, mashed potatoes, white, fluffy, with real butter melting into golden pools. A third tray, green beans, cooked tender but not mushy. A fourth, fresh bread, sliced thick, with more butter and what looked like jam. "Is this?" Brenner couldn't finish the sentence. "Standard fare," Weber said quietly. "Every day. Breakfast is eggs, bacon or sausage, toast, coffee. Lunch is sandwiches, soup, fruit. Dinner is usually like this: meat, vegetables, starch, bread. Sunday dinner is even better." Krause stared at the food. His hands remained frozen on his lap. How long had it been since he'd seen butter? Real butter? Not the rancid fat substitute they'd choked down in the trenches? How long since meat wasn't rationed into portions so small you could barely taste it? "This is what American soldiers eat?" Hoffman asked. "This is what American prisoners eat," Dietrich corrected. "The guards eat in their own mess. I've seen it through the windows. The portions are similar. America fed its prisoners the same as its soldiers." Krause picked up his fork. His hand was shaking badly now. He speared a piece of beef, brought it to his mouth. The flavor exploded across his tongue. Rich, savory, real. He'd forgotten food could taste like this. Around them, the mess hall filled with the sounds of men eating. Not the desperate, silent gulping of starving soldiers. Normal sounds. Conversation. Even laughter. At a nearby table, a group of enlisted prisoners were discussing a baseball game they'd heard on the radio. One of them was explaining the rules to his companions, who seemed baffled but intrigued by this American sport. "They're happy," Brenner said wonderingly. "How can they be happy? We lost. Germany is destroyed. We're prisoners. And they're laughing about baseball. Because they're not hungry anymore," Weber said. "Because they're safe. Because the war is over, and they're still alive." He took a bite of potato. "When you're not fighting for survival every minute, Brenner, there's room for other things. Even joy." Krause forced himself to eat slowly, though every instinct screamed to devour the food before it could be taken away. The beef was tender, properly cooked. The potatoes were real, not the dried, reconstituted powder they'd subsisted on. The bread was fresh, baked that morning by the smell of it. Coffee? An American corporal appeared at Krause's elbow with a pot. "Yes," Krause managed. "Thank you." The corporal poured, then moved on. The coffee was real, too dark, hot, with actual cream available in small pitchers on the table. Not ersatz, not chicory, not burned grain masquerading as coffee. The genuine article. Krause wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into his palms. Across from him, Hoffman had stopped eating. He was staring at his plate with an expression of absolute devastation. "My division," Hoffman said softly. "We were trapped in the Falaise pocket. 8 days with almost no food. Men were eating grass, drinking from puddles. I watched boys die of dysentery and starvation. I told them to hold on. I told them Germany would prevail, that their sacrifice mattered." He picked up his knife, set it down again. His eyes were wet, and here I sit, eating better than I have in 3 years, in an enemy prison, while my men are dead or scattered or in camps that probably don't have. He gestured helplessly at the table. No one spoke. What was there to say? A prisoner at the next table, a sergeant, by his bearing noticed Hoffman's distress. He stood, walked over, and said something quietly in German. Hoffman shook his head. The sergeant squeezed his shoulder and returned to his seat. He said, "It's not your fault," Dietrich translated, though they'd all heard clearly enough. "That we all did what we thought was right with what we knew. But we should have known," Brenner said. "We should have questioned. Should have seen that if Goebbels lied about this, he was probably lying about everything." Krause thought about the photographs in the propaganda ministry's pamphlets. Starving American prisoners, supposedly. Torture chambers, supposedly. All lies, designed to keep German soldiers fighting past the point of hope, and it had worked. Boys had died, rather than surrender, terrified of a fate worse than death that never actually existed. "How many?" Krause asked. "How many men died because they believed the propaganda?" Weber's face went hard. "All of them. Every single German soldier who died in this war died because of lies. Lies about Lebensraum. Lies about racial superiority. Lies about the enemy. Lies about inevitable victory. We were drowning in lies, and we drank them down like water." The meal continued in near silence after that. Prisoners filed through for seconds, and the American servers doled out more food without complaint. There was enough for everyone, more than enough. At one point, a commotion near the door drew attention. A young German prisoner had stumbled, dropping his tray. Food splattered across the floor. The boy froze, clearly expecting punishment. An American guard approached. The mess hall went quiet. The guard handed the prisoner a mop. "Accidents happen, son. Clean it up, then go get a fresh tray." That was all. No beating. No screaming. No humiliation. The prisoner cleaned the spill with shaking hands, then returned to the serving line. The Americans gave him a full portion, as if nothing had happened. "That's what broke me," Weber said quietly. "My second day here. I saw a man drop his food, saw the guard's response. I went back to my quarters and cried for an hour, because I finally understood what we'd become." Krause pushed his plate away, though it was still half full. His appetite had vanished, replaced by a sick weight in his stomach. What we'd become was clear enough. They'd become men who expected cruelty, who were shocked by decency, who'd normalized brutality so completely that kindness felt alien. The American system wasn't perfect, Krause could see that. There was still barbed wire, still armed guards, still the fundamental inequality of captor and captive. But within those constraints, they'd created something that approached dignity, something that recognized prisoners as human beings deserving of basic care. When had Germany stopped doing that? Had it ever started? Dessert? The American corporal reappeared, carrying a tray of pie, apple pie, with crust that looked flaky and golden. Krause stared at it, his vision blurred. Dessert. They gave prisoners dessert. "No, thank you," he managed. The corporal moved on. Around them, prisoners accepted pie with genuine pleasure. Some closed their eyes as they ate, savoring each bite. "I can't do this," Hoffman said suddenly. He stood, his chair scraping loudly. I need to be alone." He walked out quickly. Brenner started to follow, but Weber stopped him. "Let him go. He needs to process this in his own way." We all did. Through the mess hall windows, Krause watched Hoffman cross the compound, his shoulders hunched. A broken man, shattered not by cruelty but by kindness, because kindness was the ultimate refutation of everything they'd believed. If the enemy could be decent, what did that make them? The answer sat heavy on Krause's chest, crushing the breath from his lungs. It made them the monsters. The summons came the next morning. A lieutenant appeared at their quarters, polite but formal. "Generals? Colonel Harrison would like to speak with you. If you're available." It wasn't really a question, but the courtesy of asking was typical of the Americans. They maintained the fiction of choice even when everyone understood the reality. Krause, Brenner, and a red-eyed Hoffman followed the lieutenant across the compound to the administration building. Morning light slanted through the Texas heat, and prisoners were already at their various activities, some in the garden, others heading to work details, a few exercising in the recreation yard. They were led to an office on the second floor. Through the door's window, Krause could see a man in his 50s, sitting behind a desk, reviewing documents. The nameplate read, Cole, Robert Harrison, camp commander. The lieutenant knocked, then opened the door. The German general, sir. Harrison stood. He was tall, with iron gray hair and the weathered face of a career officer. 2 silver eagles adorned his collar. His uniform was impeccable. His bearing, professional. This was a man who'd spent decades in military service. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. Please, sit. He gestured to chairs arranged before his desk. Actual chairs, not interrogation stools. On a side table sat a coffee service. Would you like coffee? It's fresh. They accepted. More from habit than desire. An aide poured, then withdrew, closing the door behind him. Harrison settled back into his chair, studying them with sharp but not unkind eyes. I wanted to speak with you early in your internment here. Get ahead of questions you're undoubtedly having. Why? The word escaped Krause before he could moderate his tone. Why treat us like this? We were your enemies. We killed your soldiers. Our nation perpetrated. He couldn't finish. The full scope of what Germany had done was still emerging, but enough was known to make the shame unbearable. Harrison didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of coffee, choosing his words carefully. Tell me, General Krause, what were you told about American POW camps? That they were death camps. That prisoners were tortured, starved, worked to death. And what have you experienced here? The opposite of everything we were told. Harrison nodded. Dr. Goebbels was an effective propagandist. He understood that if German soldiers believed surrender meant torture, they'd fight longer, die more readily. He weaponized fear. But why counter it? Brenner asked. Why not let us believe the lies? We're defeated. We're prisoners. What does it matter what we think? It matters because of what comes after, Harrison said. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the compound. This war will end, gentlemen. Soon, by all accounts. And when it does, Germany will need to be rebuilt. Not just physically, ideologically. He turned to face them. Every German soldier in American custody is a data point. You'll go home eventually, most of you. You'll talk to your families, your neighbors, your countrymen. You'll tell them what you experienced as prisoners. If we torture you, you'll report that Americans are savages. If we treat you decently, you'll report something very different. Propaganda, Hoffman said bitterly. American propaganda to counter German propaganda. No. Harrison's voice was firm. Truth. What you're experiencing here isn't a show for your benefit. This is how America operates. We're bound by the Geneva Convention because we choose to be. Because we believe in the rule of law, even in war. Especially in war. He returned to his desk, pulling out a folder. Do you know how many German POWs are currently held in camps across the United States? Over 370,000. We could treat them brutally, God knows we'd have justification after what was found in the concentration camps. But we don't. Because that's not who we are. The concentration camps. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. They all knew. Now. The reports were filtering through, even to prisoners. The full horror of what had been done in Germany's name. I'm a soldier, not a diplomat, Harrison continued. But even I understand that how we treat you now affects what Germany becomes next. If we brutalize you, we create martyrs, fuel resentment, plant seeds for future conflicts. If we show you that civilization can include mercy, that strength doesn't require cruelty, then maybe when you go home, you'll remember that. Krause felt something crack inside his chest. It was a strategic decision. The Americans weren't being kind for kindness' sake. They were investing in the future. But somehow that made it more impressive, not less. They were thinking decades ahead, building peace through their treatment of prisoners. The food, Brenner said. It's better than what we fed our own soldiers. American agricultural capacity is substantial, Harrison acknowledged. We can afford to feed prisoners adequately. But more than that, We believe that maintaining human dignity requires meeting basic needs. Hunger makes men desperate, brutal. Well-fed men can think beyond survival. He opened the folder, revealing documents. You'll be here for some time, maybe months, maybe longer, depending on when your repatriation is approved. During that time, you can make this easy or hard. We're not asking you to betray Germany that's still your nation, for better or worse, but we are asking you to conduct yourselves with the honor that your ranks demand. And if we refuse, Hoffman's voice was sullen, then you'll be disciplined according to camp regulations. Isolation, loss of privileges, but not torture, not starvation. Those tools are not in our arsenal. Harrison closed the folder. I'm told you're all intelligent men. You've commanded troops, made strategic decisions. I'm appealing to that intelligence now. Look at what you've seen here and ask yourself, which system do you want to be part of going forward? The question was rhetorical, but it landed like a punch. Krause thought about the meal last night, the medical care, the quarters with flowers on the desk, the American guard who'd helped a German prisoner clean up, spilled food without punishment. Then he thought about the Eastern Front. Villages burned, civilians executed for harboring partisans, Soviet POWs left to starve in open pens. The casual cruelty that had become so normalized he'd stopped noticing it. The Geneva Convention, Krause said slowly. You actually follow it, to the letter, as much as possible. Harrison sat back down. Are we perfect? No. There are probably guards in some camps who overstep. Mistakes happen. But the system, the policy, is clear. Prisoners are to be treated humanely, even after. Hoffman gestured vaguely. After the camps. After what we did. Harrison's expression hardened, especially after. Because if we respond to barbarism with barbarism, the cycle never ends. Someone has to be the adult in the room. Someone has to say this far, no further. America chose to be that someone. The silence that followed was heavy. Krause could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Outside, a guard called orders to a work detail. Normal sounds of a military installation, but nothing about this was normal. This was an occupied nation treating its prisoners better than Germany had treated its own citizens. What do you want from us? Brenner asked finally. Cooperation within reason. Participate in camp activities. Follow regulations. If intelligence officers ask you questions, you're within your rights to refuse, but it would help us all if you'd at least discuss general military matters. Nothing that compromises your men still in the field, but perspectives on strategy, doctrine, that sort of thing. And in exchange, you continue to be treated in accordance with the convention. You get regular meals, medical care, access to recreation and education. When the war ends, you'll be repatriated as soon as practical. Harrison leaned forward. And in the meantime, gentlemen, you have a choice. You can spend your internment bitter and resistant, making things harder for yourselves and everyone around you. Or you can use this time to really think about what you believed, why you believed it, and who you want to be when you go home. Krause felt tears prick his eyes. He blinked them away, ashamed. I don't know who I am anymore, he admitted. Everything I thought I knew is wrong. Harrison's expression softened. Then you have time to figure it out. That's the gift of survival, General. The chance to become someone better than you were. The meeting concluded shortly after. As they left the office, Krause felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. The certainties that had structured his entire adult life were gone. But in their absence, there was space for something new. In the hallway, Hoffman stopped. He's right, you know, about us spreading the word when we go home. If we go home, Brenner said. When? Hoffman's voice was stronger now. Germany will need officers who understand what we've learned here. Who can explain that there's another way? Krause looked at his companions. 3 generals, stripped of rank and nation, forced to confront uncomfortable truths in a Texas POW camp. We were the ones in prison, he said quietly, the whole time. We just didn't know it until they let us out. The days following their meeting with Colonel Harrison fell into a rhythm that was both alien and strangely comforting. Krause found himself drawn to observation, watching the Americans, studying them the way he'd once studied terrain before a battle. What he saw contradicted everything his training had taught him. The morning after their first week, Krause took coffee to a bench near the perimeter fence. From there, he had a clear view of the guard rotation change. The Americans conducted it with military precision, reports delivered, posts assigned, weapons checked, professional. But between the formalities, they joked. They talked about letters from home, about baseball scores, about a poker game planned for that evening. They were boys, most of them. 20, maybe 22 years old. The same age as the men Krause had commanded. But these American soldiers laughed easily, their faces open and unguarded. First time really looking at them? Colonel Weber joined him on the bench, carrying his own coffee. I saw them as enemies, Krause admitted. As obstacles to be removed. I never thought about them as people. None of us did. That's how they trained us. Weber sipped his coffee. But watch them long enough. You start seeing the humanity. It's uncomfortable. A guard approached their section of fence, a corporal named Davies, according to his name tag. He was young, maybe 19, with freckles and red hair that spoke of Irish ancestry. He nodded politely to the German officers. Morning, sirs. How's the coffee? Good, Krause replied in careful English. Thank you. No problem. Hey, you guys play chess? Some of the fellas were talking about setting up a tournament. Mix of prisoners and guards, just for fun. A tournament? Weber's eyebrows rose. Between guards and prisoners, Davies shrugged. Why not? It's just chess. Good way to pass time. He grinned. Plus, I could use the practice. My girlfriend back home kicks my butt every time we play. He wandered off, continuing his patrol. Krause stared after him. Girlfriend, he said. He talks about his girlfriend to enemy prisoners. Because to him, we're not enemies anymore, Weber said. We're just guys stuck in the same place for a while. The war's over for us. We're no threat. So why maintain the hostility? Krause thought about German guards he'd known. How they'd treated prisoners, any prisoners. The distance they'd maintained, the casual cruelty. To be weak was to be contemptible. To be captured was to deserve whatever came next. But Corporal Davies saw captured men as just men. Over the following days, Krause expanded his observations. He watched the Americans during mealtimes, during recreation, during their own leisure hours. Patterns emerged. The guards rotated regularly. No one stood post for more than 4 hours. When they finished their shifts, they'd gather in their own recreation area. Through the fence, Krause could see them playing cards, reading, writing letters. Just like the prisoners, they talked about home constantly. Minnesota winters, California beaches, Texas barbecue, New York crowds. The American soldiers were intensely regional, their identities tied to specific places in ways that felt almost tribal. But they still unified under a broader national identity. Not through force, Krause realized, through shared values. One afternoon, he witnessed an altercation. 2 prisoners, both junior officers, got into a heated argument over something trivial. Voices rose. Other prisoners formed a circle, not intervening, but watching. An American sergeant approached. Gentlemen, that's enough. One of the Germans, a lieutenant named Vogel, turned on him. This is not your concern. This is between German officers. The sergeant didn't escalate. He didn't draw his weapon or call for backup. He simply said, "You're in my camp. It's my concern. You want to settle this with your fists. That's your choice. But you do it in the boxing ring, with gloves and a referee. Or you handle it like adults and walk away. Which is it?" The offer surprised Krause. Boxing ring? They had a boxing ring? Vogel and his opponent looked at each other, then at the sergeant, then back at each other. The absurdity of the situation seemed to deflate their anger. They walked away in opposite directions. The sergeant noticed Krause watching. You'd be surprised how many disputes get resolved when guys realize they're being stupid. Giving them a legitimate outlet, Helps. You have a boxing ring, Krause said. Yeah. Friday night fights, completely voluntary. We get guards and prisoners both participating. Good exercise. Controlled aggression. Beats having guys tear each other apart in the barracks. That evening, curious, Krause asked Weber about the Friday fights. Oh, they're quite the event, Weber said. The whole camp turns out. 3-round bouts, proper rules. I've seen American guards fight German prisoners hard, competitive matches, and then shake hands afterward and get a beer. Beer? The canteen sells it. Light beer, limited quantities, but yes. On Friday nights, if you've got the scrip and you're not on restriction, you can buy 2 beers. Krause tried to imagine a German POW camp where prisoners and guards boxed for sport, then shared drinks. The image wouldn't form. It was too alien. On Friday, he attended the fights. The recreation hall was packed, prisoners and guards mixed together, placing small wagers, cheering for their favorites. The atmosphere was boisterous but friendly. The first match was between 2 German prisoners. They fought with skill and determination, and when it ended in a draw, both were applauded equally. The third match was German versus American, a prisoner named Schmidt against Corporal Davies, the red-haired guard from the fence. They touched gloves, and the bell rang. It was a good fight. Davies was faster, but Schmidt had reach. They traded punches, neither gaining clear advantage. The crowd roared for both fighters, nationality forgotten in appreciation of skill and courage. In the second round, Schmidt landed a solid cross that bloodied Davies' nose. The crowd gasped. For a moment, Krause worried about repercussions, but Davies just grinned, blood streaming down his face, and came back harder. The fight went all 3 rounds, ending with Davies winning by narrow decision. Afterward, they embraced. Davies clapped Schmidt on the back, saying something that made the German laugh. Then they walked together to the canteen, where other prisoners and guards bought them beers, enemies, sharing drinks after trying to pummel each other unconscious. Krause found Colonel Harrison watching from the back of the hall. The camp commander noticed his approach and nodded acknowledgement. Interesting, isn't it? Harrison said. I don't understand how this works, Krause admitted. How they can fight each other and then be friends, because they separated the combat from the personal. Davies and Schmidt just spent 9 minutes trying to hit each other as hard as they could, but it wasn't personal. It was sport, and when it was over, they could recognize the other man's courage and skill without resentment. In Germany, we didn't separate those things. Combat was personal. The enemy was enemy, completely and always. I know. Harrison's tone was sympathetic. That's part of what you're learning here. That you can oppose someone's actions without dehumanizing them. That yesterday's enemy can be today's chess partner. It's not weakness, it's emotional maturity. Krause watched Davies and Schmidt laughing together, sharing a pitcher of beer with mixed company of Germans and Americans. None of them seemed to think the situation was remarkable. They've moved past the war, Krause said. Some faster than others. But yes, because we've given them permission to. The Germans in this camp don't have to hate Americans anymore. And the Americans don't have to hate you. That creates space for something healthier. Later, walking back to quarters under the Texas stars, Krause reflected on what he'd witnessed. The American soldiers were, without question, his enemies. They'd fought against Germany, contributed to its defeat, killed German soldiers, but they were also young men who missed their homes, who joked and played games, who tried their best to be decent even in difficult circumstances. They were, in every meaningful way, exactly like the men Krause had commanded. The difference wasn't the men. It was the system they served. Germany had created a system that demanded absolute loyalty, that punished weakness, that glorified cruelty as strength. It had turned ordinary men into instruments of atrocity by convincing them that certain people weren't fully human. America, imperfect, still grappling with its own contradictions, had created a system that at least tried to maintain dignity even in war. That treated prisoners as human beings deserving of basic respect. Which system was stronger? Which was more likely to endure? Krause was beginning to suspect he knew the answer, and it shamed him. 2 weeks into his internment, Krause received a letter. The arrival itself was shocking. He hadn't expected mail to reach him, hadn't even known who might write. The American lieutenant who delivered it waited politely while Krause stared at the envelope. "From your daughter, sir," the lieutenant said. "It came through the Red Cross network. Took a while to route here. His daughter, Margaretha." Krause's hands shook as he opened it. The letter was brief, written in his daughter's careful hand. She was alive, living in what remained of their hometown, working as a nurse in a makeshift hospital. His wife had died in the bombing of 44. Krause had known that, had received the news through military channels. But Margaretha was alive. "The Americans give us food," she wrote. "Not much, but enough. They could starve us. They would have right to, after everything. But they don't. Papa, what we did here, what Germany did, I cannot write it. But the Americans are more merciful than we deserve." Krause read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and sat on his bed, staring at nothing. More merciful than we deserve. His daughter, intelligent, educated, a nurse dedicated to saving lives, had seen what Germany had become, and she was grateful for American mercy. That evening, Krause joined Brenner and Hoffman in the common room. He shared the letter. They read it in silence. "My son wrote something similar," Brenner said quietly. "He's in the British zone. Says the British are harsh but fair, that they give rations, maintain order. He sounds relieved that it's over." Hoffman had no family left. He said nothing, but his expression was haunted. "Do you remember the rations?" Krause asked. "The last year of the war. What we fed our own soldiers. Sawdust bread," Brenner said. "Ersatz coffee that tasted like burned dirt. Soup so thin you could read through it. And the civilians? The territories we occupied? Silence. Because they all remembered. They'd been there. They'd seen German efficiency applied to stripping occupied lands of food, resources, anything of value. They'd watched civilians starve so German soldiers could eat. Except German soldiers had still starved, because the system was rotten at every level. The Eastern Front," Hoffman said suddenly. "The Soviet prisoners. Do you remember the pens?" Krause remembered. Open-air enclosures surrounded by wire, where thousands of Soviet POWs had been kept. No shelter, minimal food, no medical care. They died in droves from exposure, disease, starvation. That was military necessity. Hoffman continued, his voice hollow. "That's what we told ourselves. We couldn't spare resources for enemy prisoners. They were Slavs anyway, Untermenschen. Why waste good German food on them?" He looked up, meeting Krause's eyes. "But here I sit, in an American prison, eating roast beef and fresh bread, being treated by American doctors, sleeping in a clean bed. The Americans have resources we never had, yes. But even if they were rationing, I don't think they'd let us starve. Because they don't see us as Untermenschen. They see us as men. We were monsters," Brenner whispered. "God help us. We were the monsters all along." The door opened. Colonel Weber entered, followed by several other German officers, all colonels or majors, all internees at Camp Herne. They looked grim. "We've been talking," Weber said without preamble. "About what comes next. About what we tell people when we get home." "If we get home," someone muttered. "When?" Weber insisted. "The war's over. Eventually, they'll repatriate us. And when we go back to Germany, people will ask questions. What was it like in American captivity? Were the stories true? What do we tell them?" Krause asked. Weber sat heavily. "The truth. That Goebbels lied. That the Americans treated us better than we treated our own soldiers. That everything we were told about American barbarism was propaganda designed to keep us fighting a war we'd already lost. They won't believe us," Hoffman said. "They'll think we were brainwashed. That American propaganda replaced German propaganda, maybe at first. But we won't be the only ones saying it. There are hundreds of thousands of German POWs in American camps. Eventually, enough voices telling the same story. Weber shrugged. Truth has weight. A major named Steiner spoke up. But what good does truth do now? Germany is rubble. The Reich is finished. What does it matter if we admit the Americans aren't monsters? It matters, Krause said forcefully. Because Germany will need to rebuild. Not just buildings, our entire national identity. We can't do that if we cling to the lies that led us into this disaster. He stood, pacing. Words were tumbling out now. Thoughts he'd been circling for days. We believed we were superior. We believed brutality was strength. We believed the ends justified any means. And where did that take us? To defeat, destruction, and moral catastrophe. He gestured toward the window, toward the camp beyond. These Americans, these men we called mongrels and degenerates, they're showing us what actual civilization looks like. They're strong enough to be merciful, secure enough to be generous. They win wars and then feed their prisoners. That's not weakness. That's power we never understood. So what? Steiner challenged. We go home and tell everyone Germany was wrong about everything? That we should become Americans? No. We tell them Germany was wrong about what makes a nation strong. That you don't build greatness on cruelty. That treating people, even enemies, with basic dignity isn't weakness. Krause met Steiner's eyes. And yes, that maybe we should learn from people who do it better than we did. The room fell silent. Faces around the table showed conflict pride, warring with emerging truth. Patriotism struggling against evidence. Finally, Brenner spoke. My father fought in the Great War. He came home and said Germany must never lose its martial spirit. That we'd been stabbed in the back. Betrayed. He raised me to believe the next war would restore German honor. He looked around the table. I think my father was wrong. I think a lot of our fathers were wrong. And I think if we don't admit that, if we don't learn from it, we're doomed to repeat it. Weber nodded slowly. Then we're agreed. When we go home, we tell the truth. All of it. The good treatment we received. Yes, but also why the Americans did it, because they believe in something bigger than revenge. Because they're trying to build a different kind of future. They won't thank us for it, Hoffman warned. Germans who've lost everything won't want to hear that the enemy was decent. Probably not. Krause agreed. But our country is full of people telling comfortable lies. It needs some of us to tell uncomfortable truths. 3 nights later, after lights out, the 3 generals met in Krause's quarters. It had become their habit, a quiet hour after the camp settled, when they could speak freely without audience. Tonight, though, the conversation turned darker than usual. I've been thinking about responsibility, Brenner said. He sat at Krause's desk, the small lamp casting shadows across his face. How much of what happened is our fault? Personally, I mean, not Germany's, ours. Hoffman shifted uncomfortably on the bed. We followed orders. So did the Gestapo. So did the camp guards. Brenner's voice was hard. At what point does following orders become an excuse rather than an explanation? Krause stood by the window, watching the compound's night lights. I knew, he said quietly. Maybe not the full scope, not the factories of death. But I knew we were doing terrible things. I heard reports from the East. I saw how we treated civilians in occupied territories. I knew, and I did nothing. What could you have done? Hoffman demanded. Speak up? They'd have shot you for defeatism. Refuse orders? They'd have shot you for insubordination. There was no good choice. There's always a choice, Brenner said. It might be a choice between bad and worse, between your life and your conscience, but it's still a choice. We chose survival. We chose to keep doing our duty even when duty required monstrous things. You wanted us to commit suicide. Hoffman's voice rose. To throw away our lives in meaningless gestures? No. But I wanted us to at least admit what we were doing. To ourselves, if no one else. Brenner turned to face him. Instead, we told ourselves lies. That it was necessary. That the enemy was worse. That our cause was just. We built walls of rationalization around our guilt so we could keep functioning. Krause thought about those rationalizations. How many times had he explained away atrocities? The village burned because partisans operated there. The civilians executed because they failed to report partisan activity. The brutal treatment of prisoners because resources were scarce, and Germans came first. Every crime had an excuse, and he'd believed them because the alternative was unbearable. The Americans are showing us what we could have been, he said. They're not perfect. I've heard them make casual, racist remarks. I've seen how some of their own Negro soldiers are segregated. They have their own contradictions, their own failures. He turned from the window. But the fundamental premise is different. They believe in human dignity. Not just for Americans, but for everyone. It's inconsistently applied, imperfectly realized. But the belief is there, and that belief creates limits on behavior that we never had, because we believed some people weren't human, Brenner finished. Jews, Slavs, Roma, anyone we deemed inferior. Once you believe that, any atrocity becomes justifiable. Hoffman buried his face in his hands. So what do we do with this knowledge? Carry it home like a curse? Spend the rest of our lives flagellating ourselves? No, Krause said firmly. We bear witness. We tell the truth about what we did and what we saw. And we work to build something better from the ruins. Building requires hope, Hoffman said bitterly. I have none. Then find some. Krause moved to sit beside him. This camp, this American treatment, it's proof that better is possible. That nations can be strong without being cruel. That militaries can be effective without being monstrous. If they can do it, why can't we? Because we're not Americans. We're Germans. We don't. Hoffman gestured helplessly. We're not made for their kind of optimism. Maybe that's another thing we need to learn, Brenner suggested. That practical idealism isn't weakness, that believing in better doesn't make you naive. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, a guard made his rounds. His footsteps measured and calm. No urgency, no threat, just routine. Do you think they planned this? Hoffman asked suddenly. The Americans. Do you think they knew that treating us well would break us more thoroughly than any torture could? Krause considered it. Colonel Harrison said, they want us to go home with specific messages. So yes, it's strategic. But I don't think it's cynical. I think they genuinely believe in what they're doing. The propaganda value is just a beneficial side effect. That's almost worse, Hoffman said, that they're not doing it to manipulate us. They're doing it because they actually think it's right. Why is that worse? Because we can't dismiss it as tactics. We have to accept that they're actually better than us, that their system produces more decent human beings than ours did. The words hung heavy in the small room. Yes, Krause said finally. We do have to accept that. It's humiliating and painful, and completely true. Brenner stood, walking to join Krause at the window. Before the war, I believed Germany was the pinnacle of civilization. Our culture, our philosophy, our military tradition. I thought we were teaching the world how to achieve greatness. And now I think we were barbarians with good orchestras. We confused culture with civilization. We thought because we had Beethoven and Goethe, we could ignore basic human decency. We were wrong. The question, Krause said, is whether we can admit that publicly. Whether we can go home and tell Germans, broken, defeated, humiliated Germans, that we need to fundamentally rethink who we are. They'll hate us for it, Hoffman predicted. Probably, but someone has to say it. Someone has to plant the seeds for whatever comes next. A knock at the door interrupted them. Weber appeared, looking agitated. You three need to see this. Now. They followed him to the common room. Other officers had gathered, watching the radio. An American broadcast was in progress, describing scenes from the liberation of concentration camps. The details were specific, brutal, undeniable. The room was silent except for the radio's calm, professional voice describing factories of death, piles of corpses, systematic extermination on an industrial scale. When it finished, no one moved. That's what we were part of, Weber said quietly. That's what Germany did. While we fought our honorable war on the fronts, that was happening behind the lines. Hoffman made a sound like he was going to be sick. He stumbled to the lavatory. Krause sat down slowly, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He'd heard reports. He'd suspected, but having it laid out so clearly, so matter-of-factly, in an American broadcast, that wouldn't be believed if it weren't so thoroughly documented. How do we go home from this? Someone whispered. How do we face our children and tell them what their country became? The same way the Americans are facing us, Krause said. His voice sounded distant, not quite his own, with difficult honesty, with acknowledgement of wrong, with commitment to do better. And if our children don't believe us, if they think it's Allied propaganda, then we make them believe. We bear witness until they can't deny it anymore. Krause looked around the room at the assembled officers, men who'd served Germany faithfully, who'd believed themselves honorable. We failed them. We failed our children by building a nation that did this. The least we owe them is the truth. 4 months later, as spring brought slightly cooler temperatures to Texas, Krause was summoned to Colonel Harrison's office again. This time, Brenner and Hoffman accompanied him without being asked. Harrison looked tired. The war in Europe had officially ended weeks ago. The focus now was on the Pacific Theater and the massive logistics of repatriation. Gentlemen, he began, intelligence wants to interview you for the historical record. They're gathering testimonials from senior German officers about various aspects of the war. Would you be willing to participate? What do they want to know? Krause asked. Everything. Military operations, command decisions, internal Wehrmacht politics, but also, Harrison paused. They want your perspectives on the propaganda you were fed, how it shaped your decisions, what you believed versus what you know now. The three generals exchanged glances. They want us to refute Goebbels, Brenner said. Among other things, yes. Your testimonies would be valuable for counter-propaganda efforts. But more than that, they'll become part of the historical record. Future generations studying this period will read what you have to say. Krause thought about his daughter's letter, still carried in his pocket. About the young American soldiers he'd watched play baseball and joke with prisoners. About Dr. Webb, who'd removed the shrapnel from his leg in a procedure that had gone perfectly, leaving him pain-free for the first time in years. I'll do it, he said. On one condition. What condition? That I can speak freely, not what you want to hear. The whole truth, including the parts that reflect badly on us. On Germany. On me personally, Harrison smiled slightly. General, that's exactly what we want. Truth. Even when it's uncomfortable. The interviews took place over several days. A team of intelligence officers asked questions while a stenographer recorded everything. Krause found himself speaking for hours about his experiences, the rise of National Socialism, the gradual corruption of the Wehrmacht, the lies that sustained them through impossible situations. And he spoke about the meal, that first meal in American captivity that had shattered everything. I sat at that table, he told the interviewers, and I understood that everything I'd believed was false. If the Americans could treat their enemies with this much humanity, then what did that make us? We who'd claimed to be the pinnacle of civilization. He described the medical care, the clean quarters, the dignity maintained even in captivity. And he spoke about the comparison how American prisoners were fed while German soldiers starved, how the entire edifice of Nazi ideology crumbled in the face of American decency. The propaganda worked because we wanted to believe it, Krause admitted. We wanted to think we were special, chosen, destined for greatness. And rather than question that belief when evidence mounted against it, we doubled down. We ignored what we saw with our own eyes because the alternative was admitting we were wrong. And now? The interviewer asked. What do you believe now? Krause thought about it carefully. I believe Germany must face what it became, must acknowledge the atrocities committed in its name. And I believe we must learn from enemies who proved more civilized than we ever were. Brenner's testimony was similar, though more philosophical. He spoke about the moral corruption that had infected every level of German society. How ordinary men had been transformed into participants in evil through propaganda and pressure. Hoffman's testimony was the most emotional. He broke down twice, describing soldiers he'd sent to die believing they fought for something noble. If they'd known, he said through tears, if they'd known what we were really fighting for, what Germany was really doing, so many would have refused, would have surrendered, would still be alive. When the interviews concluded, Harrison thanked them personally. This wasn't easy for you, but it was important. These testimonies will help rebuild Germany. There'll be evidence that not every German officer was a fanatic, that some of you learned, changed, grew. Will it matter? Krause asked. In the grand scheme, will our words change anything? I don't know, Harrison admitted. But they'll be there, in the archives. For anyone who wants to understand how propaganda works, how it seduces even intelligent men, for anyone who wants to know what it looks like when someone confronts the lies they've believed. That evening, the three generals sat together one last time in Krause's quarters. Their repatriation orders had come through. In 2 days, they'd begin the journey back to Germany, to a nation in ruins, occupied by former enemies, struggling to understand what it had become. Are you ready to go home? Brenner asked. Krause thought about it. Home. The word had lost its meaning. Germany wasn't the place he'd left. It would never be that place again. No, he admitted, but I'm going anyway. Because someone has to tell the truth, even if they don't want to hear it, especially then. Hoffman pulled out a small notebook. I've been writing about what we learned here. Not for publication, just for myself, so I don't forget. So when people try to tell me it wasn't that bad, or that the Americans were just as brutal, I have my own testimony to remind me. Read some, Brenner suggested. Hoffman opened to a marked page. His voice was soft but steady. The first meal in American captivity taught me more about civilization than 4 years at the War College. I learned that strength doesn't require cruelty. That you can be disciplined without being brutal. That treating even your enemies with basic dignity isn't weakness. It's the mark of a society confident enough in its values to apply them universally. We Germans claim to be the master race, the pinnacle of human achievement. But we couldn't conceive of feeding our prisoners the same food we ate. We couldn't imagine treating captured officers with the respect their rank demanded, regardless of nationality. We talked about honor constantly, yet we had no idea what the word meant. The Americans showed us, not through lectures or propaganda, but through the simple act of consistent decency. They gave us clean beds and hot food and medical care because they believed we deserved these things as human beings, regardless of what we'd done in service of an evil regime. That belief, that fundamental assumption of shared humanity is what we lacked, and lacking it, we became monsters. When he finished, silence filled the room. That's what we tell them, Krause said finally. That's the truth we carry home. 3 days later, General Wilhelm Krause stood at the gate of Camp Herne for the last time. A truck waited to take them to the port, to the ship, to whatever came next. American soldiers loaded their minimal belongings. Colonel Harrison stood nearby, observing the departure of yet another group of repatriates. Krause approached him, extending his hand. Harrison shook it firmly. "Thank you," Krause said, "for treating us like men, for showing us what we could have been." Harrison nodded. "Take it home, General. Help build something better from the ruins. We will try. That's all anyone can do." As the truck pulled away, Krause looked back at the camp. The guard towers and barbed wire, yes. But also the gardens, the library, the recreation hall, where men had learned to be human again. It had been a prison, but also a strange kind of sanctuary. A place where comfortable lies had died, and uncomfortable truths had taken root. Years later, when historians asked him about the turning point, the moment when he understood that everything had to change, Krause would think back to that first meal. The smell of real food, the taste of coffee, the simple human decency of Americans who'd had every reason to treat him cruelly, but chose not to. "Goebbels told us the Americans were savages," he'd say. That surrender meant torture and degradation. And then we surrendered, and they gave us breakfast. He'd pause, remembering. A breakfast of lies, falling apart in my mouth, but also the first honest meal I'd eaten in years, because everything that followed was true. The truck drove on, carrying 3 German generals toward an uncertain future, armed with nothing but difficult truths and the fragile hope that truth still mattered. Behind them, Camp Hearn's flag snapped in the Texas wind stars and stripes, symbol of a nation that had proven mighty enough to be merciful. And perhaps, Krause thought, that was the ultimate victory. Not in destroying Germany, but in showing Germans what they could become. The war had ended with bombs and surrenders. But the real battle, the one for Germany's soul, was just beginning. And its outcome would depend on men like him, willing to say the uncomfortable, unpopular truth. We were wrong. They were right. And we must learn from that.